Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on utilizing community advisory groups. I'm Renee Barrio. I'm the head of curatorial affairs at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm joined by three panelists today who I'll introduce in just a moment. The format for our presentation is going to be conversational and informal. We're going to like our panelists to be able to talk to each other, and we're going to have some questions that I'll pose, and then we'll also have the opportunity to take questions from attendees. So you'll be able to submit your questions, and then we'll be able to look at those and hopefully get to as many of those questions as possible in the course of about an hour and 15 minutes. Before I go any further, I just want to thank the staff at AAMC who's made the process really smooth for us. Judith, Monica, and Kayla, and also to thank my panelists as we get started. So to welcome our speakers, they will be sharing their experiences working with community advisory groups, their firsthand experiences and real world experiences so that we can get some really practical advice from them on process, on approach, procedures, lessons learned. So joining me are Adrian Locke, Senior Curator at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Hello, Adrian.
Hello.
Regan Pro, who is the Kayla Skinner Deputy Director of Education and Public Engagement at the Seattle Art Museum. Welcome, Regan.
Good morning.
And finally, Ben Tremillo. Ben is the Executive Director at San Antone Cultural Arts, also located here in San Antonio. Welcome, Ben.
Hello.
Thank you all again for joining me and for your participation. Rather than give sort of lengthy biographies and introductions of our panelists, I would like to direct you to the AAMC website, or curators.org, where you can find complete information on our panelists today. The focus of this webinar is to explore how museums and organizations utilize community advisors in a variety of ways, for example, to develop and refine exhibition checklists, to open conversations about collecting practices and collecting directions, and to also ensure that programs accurately and genuinely reflect the communities that they're serving and engage those communities as well. So as I mentioned, our panelists will be looking at some case studies, current approaches, and also successes and failures. Our panelists represent a range of institutions in scale, location, and they really present a kind of a broad spectrum of the work that's being done today. So to begin, I've asked each of the panelists to start with a brief example or a case study that they can share with us to sort of get a sense of their point of view and the position they're coming from. So we're going to start with Adrian. So thank you, Adrian.
Sure. For those of you who don't know anything about the Royal Academy of Arts, just to give you a brief overview, we are a rather old and long-serving institution in the heart of London. We celebrated 250 years last year, and probably since the mid-1970s, we've had an ambitious roster of temporary loan exhibitions. And so we have in many ways, we have two different hats. We have a hat which is very much about British art and representing British artists. And also we have this very international focused exhibition program. And that program is very varied and encompasses all kinds of cultures and periods of art and movements and individual artists and so on and so forth. So in many ways, although we have a collection which is largely British art, our reach, or our ambition rather, is much more international and outward looking. Most recently, I suppose, a good example of something that we did which relates to the topic of this webinar was an exhibition about the arts of the Pacific called Oceania, which opened in September last year and closed around just before Christmas, so a sort of standard 12-week run for the exhibition. Now, as you could probably imagine, the Pacific arts is not something the Royal Academy has in any sense at all in terms of its own collection, which I mentioned is really focused on British art, and nor do we have curatorial expertise on the subject. So in order to set about putting on an ambitious, in fact, I should also probably point out, it was the first time that an exhibition of the whole of the Oceanic or Pacific region had been staged in the United Kingdom. For us, we had to reach out, obviously, and this is something that we're quite used to doing, reach out to notable experts in the field who can form the lead curatorial kind of input, if you like, of the exhibition, working alongside myself or some of my other colleagues. We form a curatorial team and we rely on their expertise, not just in terms of their knowledge, but also in terms of their international reach and colleagues and so on and so forth. But that in itself is often not sufficient when you're doing a very ambitious program, particularly of a subject or material that kind of comes from or engages with indigenous populations in the Pacific as well. And we're very mindful of the fact that we are a British institution and we are looking at international cultures. And one of the things that we can't presume is to hold the knowledge ourselves and to make decisions about the content of shows without seeking proper advice. So not only do we have our guest curators, in this case it's the Australian-born Nicholas Thomas and the Samoan, the New Zealander of Samoan descent, Peter Brunt, who are our lead curators, but we also formed a kind of advisory committee. And that was a very wide-ranging number of participants who were approached with the idea of supporting the concept of the exhibition, having an understanding of and access to the thrust of the exhibition, the content and the ideas in the exhibition, which it led to a kind of a way of gathering support in the region for the project and helping us make connections and also facilitating acquiring those objects that we wanted to put in the exhibition on temporary loan. So in some ways it's a kind of two-stage process for us with this particular subject, and we do that with other we have done that very successfully with other exhibitions as well. So we have our core curatorial team, and then we have this overarching committee which is kept abreast of what we're doing, but also are there to provide a kind of support for us in many different directions. And for the case of Oceania, so I don't want to labor the point, but I mean, you know, for Oceania, these were very important people based in Hawaii or in New Zealand or other important places that we were representing in the exhibition. And we were extremely conscious of the fact that we are dealing with objects that, as became more and more apparent to us as we progressed through the exhibition process, of how significant these cultural objects still remain to the populations of the islands in the Pacific that were being represented, even if those objects had been taken or collected or exchanged or sold or purchased more than 200 years ago. They still retained a very strong, tangible connection through back to the people of those particular islands, and so it was a very sensitive process, particularly for I mean, in my experience of having worked on different types of exhibitions, this was quite new to me, and I think we not only did we learn a lot, but we also began to realize that these objects, many of which, you know, people walk into museums, particularly European museums, which is where we largely borrowed material from, but not exclusively. People see objects behind glass in cases, and they have an appreciation of the immediate kind of beauty of these objects. They may not understand the function of them. But what we began to realize increasingly as we worked with this material was that they have an inherent kind of power that speaks beyond our comprehension to directly back to the people from which they originated. So it was a very kind of layered experience, and I mean, a very rewarding one, but you know, it was incredibly important for us to have those guides helping us understand not only the importance of these objects, but helping us to put them in the right context, and also facilitate and give their support to the exhibition as a whole.
Great, great. Thank you, Adrian. We're going to now hear from Regan in Seattle.
Hi, everybody. So I work at Seattle Art Museum. I oversee the education and the community engagement and public engagement efforts. And so we have a long history of working with advisory groups, both for specific projects and then also ongoing advisory groups and ongoing partnerships. But a couple of years, we made a big shift in practice thinking about advisory groups. And that was to adopt a policy to have a community advisor group for every major special exhibition that we do. And there was lots of reasons behind this change, but a primary driver was one of our key focuses right now is thinking about racial equity. And in our current strategic plan, that's one of our 2 central goals. And as we thought about the way we've been working with advisors and working with advisory committees through an equity lens, we started to think critically and really notice that there was a lot of bias and assumption in the way we were deciding when to have an advisory group and when to not. And even the thought that we were, that the museum believed that it was their decision of when we needed expertise from others and when we had enough expertise internally, that seemed to be running counter to a lot of the work we were trying to do about being more inclusive. So we made the decision to have, as I said, these advisory groups for every major special exhibition. And we've been moving forward with that for about the last 2.5 years. And it's definitely a work in progress. We're learning as we go, and we say a lot, we're building the plane as we fly it when it comes to this. But there's 3 big takeaways so far for us. The first one is that every advisory group that we work with, that all of the members of the advisory group are paid. You know, we're asking them for their time and their expertise, and in return, they need to be compensated. The second is that every advisory group is run by a cross-divisional team. So each advisory group has a core team that is the curator of the exhibition, a member of the education and public engagement team, and a member of the communications team. And that group is responsible for setting the agendas for each meeting. They're responsible for finalizing the list of advisors, and also thinking about the structure of the process in general. And that's been really helpful for us to have institutional buy-in and this sort of sense that this work is belonging to all of us and not to just one area. I'll talk more about this later, but you know, I think also in there is a challenge of when you're trying to involve a lot of people who's keeping the process moving, and we're lucky to have some incredible staff that have provided that consistency, but I think there's a challenge there of being inclusive, but then also keeping, as we're starting a new process, having those that run smoothly. And then the third big takeaway for us is that every project, the advisory group for every project needs to look different. You know, just as each project is so different, the advisory group structure should reflect that as well. And when we started, we had this idea that all the advisory groups would meet the same amount of time and sort of along the same time frame. And then really quickly realized that, you know, a show that's a package show coming from somewhere else versus a show we're building ourselves over the course of many years, like that, those shows have really different needs. And those needs should be reflected in the way we're thinking about the advisory groups and the way they're structured, so that the impact of the advisory groups is going to be the most authentic and useful, and everyone's going to feel like their time has been well spent. So again, you know, this process of having them for every show is relatively new to us, and I'm happy to dive into more of the details in the question and answer period. But it makes me personally feel really excited and really hopeful about the work we're doing. I think it's only strengthening our connections to our community, the residents of the exhibitions we're doing, and I think it's also just broadening the way we think about what is expertise, and how how are we inviting lots of different forms of knowledge production and expertise sharing within our institution?
Thank you, Regan. Finally, we'll hear from Ben.
Thank you. So Untitled Cultural Arts is a community arts nonprofit here on the west side of San Antonio. And we've been around since 1993. Our mission is to foster human and community development through community-based arts. And the way we do that is through our programming. We have an after-school arts program. It's free for youth ages 7 to 18. And we teach them art basics, art history, a little bit of art theory. And it's open to any youth from the city of San Antonio. We have a community newspaper where adults, youth, and seniors can write stories, send in photographs, art, poetry, just any way that they want to sort of express themselves and tell stories about who they are, about their neighborhoods, about their families, friends. And so it's kind of open up to the entire city of San Antonio and to what they want to say about their neighborhoods. And finally, we have a community mural program, and that's probably what I'll be talking most about here. We have 59 murals throughout the city of San Antonio. For an example, as far as how we involve community, I'll use our most recent mural. It's number 60 that we're working on right now. For our mural process, we invite community into community meetings where they give us feedback on what they want to see in the mural projects. So for each mural, we'll have a theme. This mural, number 60, it was approached to us by the city of San Antonio and the Transportation and Capital Improvements Department, along with Vision Zero, which is a multinational initiative to reduce traffic accidents and traffic deaths. So that was our theme going forward. We had 4 meetings with the community. We have artists that we work with who understand that the process is going to involve community input, and it's not their vision that's going to go on this wall. It's the community's vision that's going to go on the wall. And it's their job to take all the input that we get from the meetings to make sure that what we're representing what the community wants to see. So we had several meetings. We had mock-ups after each of those meetings, and we all finally came to a consensus. The city was there. We had a representative from Vision Zero there. We had community members there, and we had the artists there, as well as people from our own department, from our own organization, who kind of looked at the final mock-up and gave an approval process at that point. And I think that that's important because this mural is going to go up in the community. It's going to go up in somebody's neighborhood. We want the people that live in the neighborhood are going to see it every day or live across the street from it to have buy-in and to kind of give us, say, yes, this is what we want to see. I think when we first started this process, we had an idea of maybe what could go on this mural. But when we had the meetings, we realized that we were kind of wrong about that. The community has their own ideas as far as what they want to see in their art. And we came away with a much better mural, I think, because we took that input and the artists understood that, we really have to get that community buy-in, that engagement, and that investment from them. Part of the process as well, once we start painting, we'll have community paint days. So we invite the community to come back in and actually help us paint the mural. Our artists are also hired to make sure that they're guiding the community members that show up. It's youth, it's seniors, it's adults, people of all ages and of all artistic backgrounds. Some people who, have a very deep understanding of art and want to volunteer their services, and people like me who can't draw a stick figure, they can come in and participate as well and, just paint something. We'll tell them this is going to be blue over here, so paint that blue, and people can do that. And I think that's another part of the process where community can really buy into it, invest themselves in it, and engage with art. And once it's all done, we'll have an unveiling and a blessing and invite the community back. And it's kind of a presentation from us to the whole city of San Antonio that this isn't our artwork anymore. This belongs to the city and to the community and the people that participated in from beginning to end. And so I think that, for us, we found that that's the best way to engage people in art. and to have them invested in this community art. I think that if they do it from beginning to end, they have real buy-in in it. They're less likely to tag it. It's just a matter of us recognizing that we're not just putting what we want to see up on a wall, we're putting what the community wants to see up on a wall. And for us, that's something that we've done since we started, and we're going to continue to do that.
Great, thank you, Ben. I think we're already seeing that we're getting a real range of perspectives of scale, and also we're seeing, hearing a lot about a lot of different kinds of communities. And so what I want to do for our first question is to explore a little how we define community. And I'm going to start with Regan on that question. Just if you could talk a little about how the Seattle Art Museum defines community.
Sure. I mean, I think that's a big question. And I think community, like engagement, like lots of terms, like even equity, it gets thrown around a lot without a lot of framing. For example, we've had some interesting conversations at the Seattle Art Museum about how we define community and how we talk about community versus our members versus our board, and why do we not think of all these people as community, or why do we not call them a community? And I think, historically and continuing, community is often a term, a really coded term to refer to people who are historically underrepresented and in museum settings in lots of ways. And so I think it's often a coded way to talk about visitors that the museum perceives as other than itself. So that's something that we think about a lot. I think when we're talking about community advisory groups and who the community is there, we're looking at each special project or exhibition and trying to identify what are the themes of that exhibition, what's being represented in that show, what are the audiences that we have that we want to connect to that exhibition, and then from that building a specific community for this show. So this may come up in some later questions too, but I think there's also a danger in these groups. For us, we have 6 to 8 people in our community advisory group. And let's say we're thinking about a show and I think that there's a danger in thinking, well, if you have one representative on your group from a specific demographic, that somehow is, they're speaking for the entirety of their community as well. So even within this idea of breaking it down through demographics, how are we recognizing like the intersectionality of everyone's identities that they're bringing to this group, and how that should inform the way we're making decisions. I think also it's interesting when you're thinking about community advisory groups, as much as there's a need to really define what we mean by community, also defining what we mean by advising. Because I think there's a danger sometimes in forming these groups, and rather than forming community advisory groups, we're really forming community approval groups, and we're looking for getting community members to sign off on what we're doing rather than to actually provide feedback and buy-in. And so how are you cautious and really clear as a museum? What is the goal? What are we really asking the participants to do? And how are we involving them in like authentic decision making if we're calling this an advisory group?
Ben, I'd like you to address this idea of community as well, because I think you're dealing with almost sometimes a very specific community, and how do you broaden that, and how do you invite sort of other members into the story?
Right. So we are located right in a neighborhood. We're not in a major thoroughfare. We're basically just one building among a lot of houses in the neighborhood, and it's in the zip code 78207, which is historically an underserved population here, not just in San Antonio, but across the nation. It's always been recognized as one of the most underserved and poorer zip codes in the nation. So we kind of see our mission as working with underserved communities. We'll work here on the west side and other parts of town too, but most of the time we're working in areas that are historically underserved. So I think that by doing that, and being mindful of that and very intentional about how we do that, because I'll go back to the mural that we did for this one, we did on the east side of town, which is historically, again, a pocket of the city that is underserved. And I know that as we were putting up the mural, as we were working on a wall, and the artists were there, every day people just came up. They either wanted to participate or just say how much they really enjoyed seeing the work. Every day the artist would tell me something as far as how they interacted with the community, how the community was interacting with them. And I think once we had the unveiling and we had just about 200 people there, all I heard, most of the day was, don't let this be the only project you're doing here on this side of town. We want to see more of this. We want to see more of this kind of work, because I think communities sometimes that are underserved, they feel forgotten, or they feel like they're not getting the same sort of things that other parts of town maybe get. And so I think it's important to listen to what they have to say about the artwork they want to see in their community, but also to kind of reach out and actually do the artwork in their community. It's one thing, I think, for us to maybe try to have work in different parts of town, but we really need to be mindful and intentional as far as where we're going, and realizing and recognizing there are areas of the city that really need to see this sort of artwork in their neighborhoods and their communities, who really want to participate in this kind of process and who really would benefit, I think, from participating in this as well. So I think that's why we work with underserved communities the most. It's because the most need is there.
Great, great. I'd like to explore a little about how you create a diverse committee or a diverse group to work with, and how you select sort of the members of your advisory committees, and how do you make sure you have diversity. And I'd like to just throw that question out to Adrian to talk about his experience with that, and the way that they've created the complexion of their committee.
Well, yeah, I mean, every time we make a committee or organize a committee, it is always, as Regan was kind of suggesting, it's very project-based. It's very, each time you build a new one to serve a particular function. So it's very much driven by the content of that particular, in our case, exhibition. And in many ways, I think when we look to formulate that commission, and sometimes actually we've had more than one for an exhibition. We've had a sort of an honorary group with very distinguished individuals, and a scientific, or you might call a scientific committee, with people who are much more on the ground and able to facilitate things within different institutions. So it does vary. I think often we look to have great grandees of their particular fields, people who are, I think particularly with Oceania, we needed individuals who had commanded respect of their communities, not just immediate communities, but also the island communities, so that they had a significant profile, and were seen to be, and were indeed kind of representative of a greater population than their immediate communities. So spokespeople for, I suppose, for want of a better word, for indigenous communities. In other instances, we've looked to leading curators, in particular, those that will be able to not only steer us in a direction in terms of content of a show, for example, Megan Tamati Quinnell of Te Papa in Wellington in New Zealand, who's a Maori curator, contemporary art, someone who can not only facilitate loans from her own institution, for example, but also to point us in the direction of new, interesting, important, significant artists that we need to consider to have contact with, to have discussions with. So it works on different levels. Often it could be, if you have the support of a curator in a major institution from which you're hoping to borrow, that the expectation, I suppose, or the hope is that they will facilitate loans from their own collection that they will help guide those through internal procedures and so on. But we also, I think, need that expertise to help us navigate what can be quite complicated and diverse kind of areas, and to actually open up more ideas and themes to explore. So it's kind of, it works on multiple levels in some ways, and you know, it could be seen as very practical, on the other hand, it can also be seen as very stimulating and thought-provoking. So we would probably look to those individuals that we ask to work for us directly, so the people we contract, those people we would like to call guest curators or external curators, who have and worked with and live in a kind of subject, who will know very well who the right people, or the right people to suggest joining those committees are. So we are quite beholden really to the choice of curators that we work with is fundamental to the success of any project. I'm sure that's the same for everyone. But it's having the right curator who not only has the academic credentials and understanding of the art that they're talking about and have been examining often for many years, but it's also their web of connection really that allows us to feed into their knowledge really and their expertise after years probably of working in areas. And I think that's kind of fundamental to the success of a project. And one has to be careful, obviously, because there can be kind of political issues that one isn't necessarily aware of, or tensions between particular individuals or institutions or communities and things that those individuals will really help us understand and navigate with more kind of security than if we didn't have them working with us.
Regan, you mentioned compensating your advisors. And that question has come up. So could you talk a little about that in a very practical way, about how you do that, how much you compensate or ranges, that sort of thing? And also, where in the museum, who creates the committee, the advisory groups? Whose responsibility is to create those and to also oversee them and lead them?
Yeah. So for compensation, it varies a little bit depending on the project, but typically we give advisors $500, and that's asking for about 6 to 8 hours of their time. And we, yeah, so that's kind of our typical compensation structure, but for projects that are more involved, that can shift. And then we're also providing parking, because our museum's in a downtown location that parking is expensive and can be prohibitive. And those, the budget for those honorary costs are within the exhibition budget. So that's something we budget for as we're planning the wider show budget. And I'm happy if anyone either in this conversation or offline wants to talk more about how that piece works, I'm happy to talk about that. As for selecting the advisory groups and how they get run, we have a process that I think is pretty fun. There's some of my CM colleagues watching this, so they may be agreeing or disagreeing when I say it's fun. But once a year, we get together and we look at the exhibitions coming up in the next year. And we have probably 30 to 40 people in the room from education, curatorial, communications, development, all different areas of the museum. And everyone brings ideas and names and suggestions for who they think should be on these different groups. And we put huge stickies up on the wall, and then everyone writes names of people they're recommending for each advisory group. And kind of going back to your earlier question about how we make sure these groups are diverse or representative, I mean, to me, I think that it's also about, it's a reflection of how our museum looks internally. You know, the more diversity and the more representation we have on our own staff, the more that's going to lead to diversity and representation in these advisory groups, because the relationships within our own staff are ultimately really dictating who we're inviting and asking to participate. And then as far as running the groups internally, there are a couple SAM staff who really have taken a heroic lead in that work and really keeping them at the train running. And helping with the process. And then again, each team is run by the core education, communication, and curatorial lead. The last piece I would say is that when we made this choice to go to having advisory groups for every show, that recommendation that came directly from our director. And that was really critical. So it wasn't curatorial or education or someone else saying, I think we should do this, but it was the director, our former director, Kim Rorschach, recommending it. So again, from the beginning, there was that institutional buy-in.
Great, thank you. Ben, the question has come up about your advisory groups, about the size of those, about how many people you're engaged, and also who in your, I know you're a very small organization, so who in your organization will run those, administer those, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're a small group. You know, there's only 4 of us. It's me. We have a mural coordinator that I work with on the murals. We have our after-school arts program coordinator, and then our community newspaper coordinator. So each of them are responsible for their programming, and I'm just kind of here to make sure the building doesn't burn down. What we do for our community meetings is we send out emails. We have a pretty good email list, and we will get, you know, quite a response from that. But also for each of the murals, we'll have at least one lead artist. Sometimes we'll have 2 lead artists. We'll have at least 1 assistant artist, if not more, depending on the size and scope of the project. We may have a lead artist and 3 or 4 assistant artists. So the artists, the lead artists and assistants, and the mural coordinator, as part of our outreach, will also go and just block walk, old-fashioned block walk. If we, if the site around where the mural wall is going to be, if it's accessible to the neighborhood, we'll send out the artist, and they'll take flyers inviting the community to come to the meetings. So we have our own email list that we send out to, plus we kind of target the community and neighborhood around where the mural site's going to be. So we'll have them flyer the neighborhood. We'll also put up posters that we print in-house, just small 11 by 17s, kind of stating what's happening. We'll talk to local businesses as well in the area to see if we can put up signage there and let people know that the community meetings are happening. And for the last mural that we had about 9 people that showed up. And for other meetings in other areas, we've had 30 people show up. So it's really open to whoever wants to be there. You know, if people want to have a voice in their public art, their community art, and they show up, you know, they're going to have a voice in what this mural is going to look like. So and each meeting's different. We'll usually have 3 to 4 meetings, and we'll have people who show up to one meeting who won't show up to the next. And of course, we'll also have people who show up to every meeting as well. And so it's kind of a nice mix. Every pocket of the city that we go to, we find that there's different people who are interested in this sort of process and project. And usually I'll run the first meeting, kind of just to get everything going and to make sure that we're getting all the voices in the room heard, that everyone is kind of giving us ideas as far as what they want to see, so the artists can kind of sit back and take all that in. And then by the last couple of meetings, the artists are then taking over because it's their project and they're the ones who are going to be leading it. So we kind of want to have the community understand that this is going to be between them and the artists. So I'm usually there at the first meeting to make sure that we're getting as many voices as we can. After that, the artists and community can kind of work together.
Thank you. So Adrian, Ben touched on some about the process and about some of the structure. I was wondering if you could talk a little about sort of what your expectations of the members of your groups is, like how many meetings they attend, what's the duration of the whole research process, that sort of thing. Just some of the practical structural parts of this.
Well, I mean, it really varies quite considerably, and we often, in fact, sort of ride on the back of other projects and initiatives to actually physically bring people together. So, for example, for Oceania, we used a conference at Cambridge University called Pacific Presences to bring members of that committee together. Similarly, for when we did a big show on the art of Byzantium, we used there was a sort of various focus groups, and we sort of rode on the back of one of the conferences in order to bring because often the reach of those groups that we reach out to are quite international, and while we seek to involve the committee, we don't have the resources to actually physically bring everyone together. It's just too costly in very blunt terms to do that. So we have to rely on other forms of kind of mediation and contact. And obviously we make sure that the input is acknowledged very publicly, both within our kind of exhibition building and also in the exhibition catalogue that comes as part of the process. But we are mindful that we're asking people for their support, but we're not actually able to financially support them in the way that we'd probably like to. But in the past, I have to say that it has worked, and it's something that we do use, not for every exhibition, but we do use for particularly ambitious shows where we know that loans can be quite complicated to negotiate, and we're also aware that I'm sure, as everybody is, that we're all engaged in what has become a very kind of lively and contested kind of space in terms of people putting on exhibitions and wanting to borrow works from museums internationally. So we are also conscious of the fact that we have to, with the support that we can get from these scientific groups, I think it just adds weight to the requests that we make, and doesn't always manifest itself in terms of loans, but it also just I think adds to the kind of importance and weight we give to each individual project.
Could you also talk about the expectations you have on your advisory committee members, and when do you bring them into the process? What's the right timing? Some sort of practical things that if somebody wanted to initiate this in their own institution, a place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically we try and set up those kind of committees very early on in the process. Now, of course, every exhibition takes a different amount of time to negotiate, to arrange, to put together. It often depends on whether you have an immediate problem. But if you're working on a show like Oceania, which we worked on for 5 years, I would say we're probably within the first year of that 5-year period, we probably would have established our committee, and likewise with Byzantium, because we know that kind of asking people to support a project of that complexity and nature, people need to understand what the exhibition is about, and they need time in order to be able to kind of not only we have to reach out to them, but they have to respond. And so we are mostly, when we're working with committees, we like to give them a good lead time. But again, that varies. As you know, some exhibitions get programmed much sooner than others. But generally speaking, it would be as early in the process as we think feasible.
Regan, could you also address that in terms of when to bring in the committee or the advisors, also what the expectations are of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we're still very much fine-tuning. When we started the process, the first meeting with advisors was typically a year before the show would open, and then we meet with them again around 6 months before the show would open, and then 3 months before the show would open. But we found that for some exhibitions, that time frame wasn't enough. For others, it was too long. So it shifts depending on the exhibition. And I think our expectations for them are that they will attend the meetings, share feedback in the meetings. We also sometimes ask for further feedback over email or with follow-up conversations, but not with the next, we're really just, the expectations really just the time that they're at the museum and the meetings. And then I think the hope / expectation is that the relationships and ideas that are coming out of these groups continue far beyond just the group meeting themselves. So that, an example may be, there may be someone in the group that then we're forming a new partnership that results in a program, or for our upcoming exhibition, Flesh and Blood, community advisors are going to be on the opening night lecture. They're going to be some of the people speaking in the panel. So there's lots of ways that we hope those relationships continue to, and that becomes like a sustaining part of our practice much beyond the end of the actual meetings.
Great, thank you. Ben, the question has come up about if you run into conflicts of interest with people on your advisory groups that are also maybe donors or have other participation. Have you experienced that? Because I know you're in a pretty tight-knit community.
Yeah, no, we haven't really experienced that. I think most of the time at the meetings that we have, community members understand what we're doing there and what we're trying to do and how we're involving them. A lot of the time, that the conflicts that arise, or maybe I think I'll go back to the last mural we did, our 59th mural. We had it was based on the east side, and the theme was just about the neighborhood where the mural was going up. It's called Denver Heights, and we wanted to just get stories from the neighborhood and get stories from people that have lived there for a long time. And a name came up from about a football coach who was from the neighborhood, who had several football teams and meant a lot to the young men in this area. And that was at the first meeting. And so we really got to hear his name and kind of understand what he meant to the community. At the second meeting we had, his whole family showed up. So we had to kind of like navigate that, because of course they wanted to recognize him as well. He had passed away, I think a year or two ago. And so they wanted to commemorate him. But we also wanted to take in all the other voices as far as what other people wanted to see on the mural as well. So we were able to kind of work through all of that, have him in a prominent position, we had 2 or 3 other people from the neighborhood as well kind of featured on the mural. And I think it's really just when you're opening this up to the community and to people from the neighborhood, they're very passionate about it. It means a lot to them. This is public art that's going up, where they live. And so they want it to be a positive representation of who they are and a positive representation of the people that are going up on this mural. And so I think it's just being mindful of that and being thoughtful about what you're doing in the process and taking all that in. And if there's any conflict, it's just trying to resolve it and trying to understand like where they're coming from and what their concerns are, and addressing those and making sure that they understand why we're doing this, how we're doing this, and why we invited them there in the first place is because we want them to participate and to buy into this mural. And I think if we can just kind of address everything that people are concerned about, it helps the artwork in the end. And everyone was very happy. I think the family, once the mural went up and they were there at the unveiling, it was just really great to see all of that and to see the whole community sort of come together for this unveiling, and to understand how this process started and what came of it at the end.
Great. Great, thank you. Regan, I'd like you to talk a little about sort of the difference between these community groups and also focus groups, because a lot of times museums will put together a focus group. And the difference between those two, and also how do you prevent a community group from just becoming an approval committee for just a kind of a yes committee that just rubber stamps everything you present?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the difference between a focus group and an advisory group, a focus group is more transactional. You're bringing them in usually for one session to get specific feedback on something, like, how is the website working, or what do you think about this campaign? Where an advisory group, it's much more relational. Again, hopefully those relationships continue beyond this work, but that there's also, it's reciprocal. We are shifting in response to what we're hearing from the group. And hopefully their perception of the museum is shifting as well in response to the work they're doing with our staff. And then, sorry, what was the second part of your question? I lost. Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Well, how do you prevent your committee from just becoming a rubber stamp approval committee?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of it, I think, is really being very transparent about what the goals of the committee are. Part of it, I think, is asking authentic questions. So only asking questions where you actually can incorporate the feedback in the way you're responding. And that doesn't mean you do everything that the advisors suggest, but that you're not asking something where actually we've already really decided what we're doing, and we're just looking for them to, that's not an authentic question. I think that's something that we are always trying to think about and be really conscious about. I think too, having buy-in from like the full institution, so that there, isn't a feeling of like, well, this decision gets made in that committee, but then it gets, it doesn't translate across the rest of the museum. And, I think also just being open and aware that and accepting of difficult conversations. It's not all, I think if you're going for a group that's really advising, you can't also assume that group's going to have a unified opinion. And so how are you navigating that and expecting that and open to that, and not just looking for a group to sort of give you a unified, like, yes, move forward. So I think sometimes that can be a part of the advisory process that's intimidating for people, is like, well, what happens if we hold this group and people don't agree with each other, not alone don't agree with us, and how do we navigate that? But again, creating space that these are complex questions and they're going to have complex answers. And if museums aren't the places to have complex conversation, then where is?
Great. Adrian, in your experience, have you brought in an outside facilitator, or who leads the group, or does someone with one of your advisors become sort of the advisor leader, or is it a staff person? Sort of, how does that work in terms of moving the group forward?
I think that it's all about personal relationships in the end. I think it's generally people. The guest curators we work with will reach out to people they already have a relationship with. Not always, I have to say, but one of the good things about having that, and I would say that our guest curators would lead that kind of communication and contact with the group, partly because they are addressing their peers, and these are people who are aware of and probably admire the work that they do. They have belief in them and are willing to support them because of their reputations and because of the work that they've already done. So in a way, we sort of stand back a little bit in the shadows and are prepared to do what we are asked to do when the time comes. But as Regan says, it's not always about people agreeing. People bring in different ideas that have to be addressed, and they have to be persuaded that those ideas that they're putting forward may or may not be recognized and implemented in different ways. So it's quite a kind of feat of diplomacy as well. You have to manage the expectations of individuals. You can't invite somebody to be part of a committee and then try and silence them, for example. That you have to listen to their advice or their opinion and navigate it as the time or the situation dictates. But I think the other thing that's really important about these committees, of course, is that while you may only have one individual who's named on the committee, that person, of course, has a way of fanning out their influence and ideas as well beyond that. So in a way, it's a kind of grid that expands all the time. So it's not just about the one individual that you've contacted, let's say in Seattle, but it's about who they know within Seattle and other museums and contacts that they have, which kind of spreads the word in many ways. So it has a kind of knock-on effect too. And sometimes we, very, very rarely, just to, say we also would invite someone to be a patron of an exhibition, which is a much sort of grander idea, and that official patronage can be quite beneficial depending on the subject of the material that you're working with, and it gives it a sort of even you have a kind of hierarchy of committees and individuals and patrons, which can be a bit confusing. But we, on occasion, do reach out and ask, sometimes important politicians or members of the royal family, that kind of individual, to give their approval to the exhibition, which then also helps amplify that kind of reach, I suppose.
Again, sort of building on what Adrian was sharing. So how do you use the feedback you get from the committee? I mean, do you is it something that you take under consideration as advice, or as sort of do you kind of let the committee vote on things? How do you actually use the committee?
So usually the first meeting is where we get all the ideas. It's just sort of a brain dump. We'll get, everything out. And we want to hear everything people have to say about the theme, what it means to them. We want to get specific images that they see, maybe words that are important to them, colors, just everything that they can give us, names of specific people. Like I said, in the previous mural, we had a lot of names come up that were important to the community. And it's really just the artist's job and the assistants to kind of get all of that, write it all down. We'll start off with, some of the things I've seen on the list are pretty sizable. There'll be specific buildings that people want mentioned, colors, and then you go further down and you really start getting into the weeds of stuff. We'll have like robot snake, or just crazy, because all the ideas, we want to get all the ideas in. So you start winnowing that out as the meetings go. You start taking all that information. The artists, after the first meeting, take as much as they can from that list and try to visualize it, try to make sense of it, and put it in a way that it's not just going to be again, it's not going to be just the brain dump on paper. It's going to actually, it's their job to kind of figure out how this all fits together and what fits and what doesn't. Unfortunately, you can't get everything into a mural because it's impossible to get all the ideas, all the input, everything else. So everything that we do is based on what the community is saying. So, it's not just they're advising us, they're actually telling us what they want to see. And it's up to the artist and up to our community mural coordinator to kind of figure out, like, what were the top things that were said? What were the top themes? What were the top ideas? What can really fit? Some things that are a little bit kind of outside the realm of what fits in the mural. We just explained to folks, we can't get everything in the mural. We'd love to. Some of these ideas are great, but thematically, it just doesn't fit. So the first meeting is kind of just the big dump, the brain dump, and then we refine it as we go on. And by the third or fourth meeting, depending on how long these meetings are going to be, we've winnowed everything down. The final meeting is sort of a kind of a presentation of what the final mural is going to look like. At that point, what we're hoping for is a real sort of blessing from the community. But we've gone through all the steps. We've talked at every meeting as far as what's going in. So we want to make sure that by that fourth meeting, it's not a surprise to people, that they're just like, this isn't at all what we said, because they're involved at every step. And we'll have a mock-up at every meeting too, so people can kind of see and tell us maybe at meeting 2, like, that's not the direction we want to go. Can you kind of implement this a little more? And by the fourth meeting, it really is, everyone's buying into it. The community that's there, the artists, people on our staff, the wall owner too. If we're working with a wall owner, we want to make sure that they're invested in that design as well, and they can live with that on their wall. And it's really about getting it all out on paper at the beginning and just refining it and getting it down to a point where the community can really say, yes, this is it. This is actually what we want to see on a wall. And it's always nice to kind of have that at the end. And even during the process of creating the mural, some things change, minor changes, of course, depending on something we didn't figure on a wall or something that we didn't anticipate happening. So it's always in motion, but it's pretty much sticking to what the community wanted from the beginning.
Regan, I'd like to talk about sort of once a project is complete, an exhibition or other kind of project, how you might use advisors in an evaluation capacity, and also what kind of relationship you have with them after the project is complete.
Those are two good questions. I would say right now we're underutilizing them a lot as an evaluation capacity. It's pretty anecdotal and informal. So we're always looking for feedback, but we don't have a formal evaluation with the advisors post the show. So something for us to develop for sure. And then I think for just sustaining relationships, it's thinking about, we were lucky to work with this group of people and to think about ways that they fit into our programming. So I gave a couple examples of, I think often for me, being in education and public engagement, we're often thinking about programming and connections there. But another example, we had a show called Double Exposure last summer, and we worked with a lot of advisors for that exhibition. And one of the advisors was a local artist named Asia Tail, and we invited Asia to come back and actually write the content for the website for that exhibition. It was the first time we had worked with someone outside of the museum to write content for the website in that way, and it was really successful and worked and a great strategy for us there. Another time I can think of, we had an advisor who worked for an organization and then brought an affinity group from their organization to host a reception during an opening part of the night. So I think, for the first take is often to think about the ways to connect them with programming or partnerships or community partnership programming, but we're also always thinking about ways to involve them in further development and marketing and curatorial projects across the institution.
Adrian, if you could address that question as well about evaluation and sort of the kind of, and going beyond just the success of the project.
Well, in a way, we have a similar kind of situation in that once the exhibition is realized and we've had all the fanfare of the opening reception and all the rest of it, then the group really sort of just dissolves, and it's a rather, suddenly, I haven't really given it much thought beforehand, but yes, I don't really know what we do in terms of following up afterwards. I mean, we give formal public kind of recognition and thanks to our advisors, but it really sort of, along with the project, when the project is realized, the group is disbanded, and I'm not entirely sure that we're very good at following up on that. That's probably something that we need to address as well, actually, how you keep that kind of community together, and how you actively maintain their support beyond your immediate requirements, to put it in that way.
Sorry, can I just jump in with one more thought on that?
Please.
I think that like in the best examples for us, that the impact of the advisors is really fundamentally changing our practice. So that, I think when we're doing our side of the work the best, then that advisory feedback really transcends the exhibition, and it becomes a part of our ongoing museum practice outside of just that project. And that doesn't certainly happen every time, or close to that, but that's where we should always be aiming.
Ben, I would like you to talk about how you acknowledge your advisors and your team, and how much of that you share with the public, and so what's their expectation of being kind of acknowledged publicly?
So we don't really do a good job of that. We really don't acknowledge the community that participate in the meetings. We do recognize all the volunteers who showed up to paint, volunteers who kind of participated in the actual process of it. But as far as the committee and the people who are at the community meetings, that's a really great idea. Thank you. I think we'll probably find a way to bring them up, in future projects, but it just hasn't been something that we do. Like I had mentioned, every meeting is a little different. So we'll get some community members who show up to the first meeting who won't go to any of the other meetings, or people who show up for, the third meeting, however it is. But we haven't done a really good job of sort of recognizing them and their contributions to the mural itself and what it looks like. It's mostly people who participate in the painting and who do that kind of work. But now that you mention it, we probably should be doing that.
Regan, could you add in here too about how you acknowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I think in basic levels, we acknowledge the advisors' names on the website for exhibitions. Sometimes, depending on the show, they're on the text panels or labels for the show as well. I mean, I think acknowledging them in ways of, providing passes for groups or for them to return. And then I think also thinking of them as as continuing partners in our work, and looking for other ways to work with them, and then all the ways we're working with them, compensating them again for their time and expertise in that work.
Adrian, for some people who are listening here, of our attendees who have not used advisors in creating projects and programs, what sort of words of caution could you offer if you're just doing it for the first time?
Well, I think you have to probably, I think you have to be very clear about what it is that you're asking them to do, and very clear about what it is you're going to provide for them, whether it's in terms of, well, we don't know whether you give them the opportunity to. Yeah, I think you have to put limits on what you can provide them, really. I mean, whether it's in terms of payment or travel or accommodation or so on and so forth. I think you just have to be very clear what the parameters of what you're asking them to do and how they may or may not be rewarded for their participation. And I don't mean in just financial terms, but I mean, obviously, you need to make sure that when you're putting a group of individuals together, that you have some sense, and obviously we take advice on this, from our kind of curators, but you get some sense of whether there are difficulties between particular relationships of individuals. There may be, often you find with artist estates, there are conflicting sides that can never be reconciled, that you can't, you can't put both parties in the same room. So I think just being aware of those kind of pitfalls. But generally speaking, I think we've found that, honesty is the best policy. We just say what we can and what we can't do for them.
Ben, can you address any words of encouragement or words of caution for starting a group?
I think that really it's just a matter of people understanding that you're there to listen to them and to take in everything that they're saying, and being open to just about anything. When I started here as an executive director in January of 2018, and the first meeting I had for a community meeting was, I was afraid of no one saying anything. I was afraid of walking into the room and, trying to talk about a mural that we had coming up, and, just silence. But it amazed me just how much people wanted to say and how much input they wanted to have. And I think, like, when you have that sort of forum and you're opening it up to people and you're letting them, just kind of say what they want about what they want to see in artwork, it really invites that feedback and that dialogue between the artist, us, and the community. And I think, if anything, I would say just keep it an open process. If you're looking to involve community in any way, to invite them and to just be open to listen to all ideas, take everything in as best you can, and the community will respond. Anytime we've had these meetings now, I recognize that all you have to do is just open it up, open up the floor to them, let everyone have a chance to speak. Don't take anything off the table. Allow everything to be said, and you're going to get a response. People are going to want to hear it. Even in a small group, I thought smaller groups would be worse. They're actually the most vocal. When you get 5 people in a room and they're all feeding off each other and they all have an opportunity to really speak and take the floor, that's when I've seen some of our best meetings with the smaller groups. Because when you have 30 people in a room, it's hard for everyone to kind of get a word in or to kind of say something. But the smaller groups tend to really be focused, to really kind of get behind each other and to really boost each other and to kind of like feed off each other as well. And those have been some of the best meetings I have. So I would just, for advice, be open to inviting community in and hearing what they have to say, and not be afraid to let everyone have a minute or two of speaking time. And they're going to respond. People are eager, and they want their voice to be heard. And I think that if you have the floor and the capability to do that, it's good to invite as many different people as you can, especially if you're looking at a specific community, to invite those people in, because they have a lot to say about artwork and about what they want to see in their neighborhood.
Great. And Regan, words of advice?
Yeah, I would say, all the same best practices for building good relationships are the same best practices for community partner groups. And, museums are places that ask questions that have multiple right answers. That's the magic of museums. And so creating spaces where you're inviting people to give us multiple right answers to the right question, and feeling comfortable that all those answers might exist at the same time and all be valid, is a really complex and powerful thing to do in a museum. So my advice is do it, go for it, and share back what you're learning, because there's so much we would love to learn more about the process.
Great. Well, we're nearly out of time. I want to thank all of the attendees. We had some great questions that came from our attendees. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I tried to get as many as I could, so I hope we covered some of your questions. I want to thank our panelists. You did a great job, and I really appreciate you. Adrian, Regan, Ben, thank you. So a recording of this session will be added to the AAMC website archives and will be available in about a week. So you can, those of you who are attending can also review it and share it. The next webinar will be on October 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for those of you who are able to join then. So again, thank you everyone, and appreciate all this great information you were able to share. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.